as I mentioned in the introduction, you spent lots of time researching the Septuagint or the Greek Old Testament. Why is that, also considering that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and not Greek?
Well, I guess the main reason for us as believers is the fact that, well, I better back up just a little. There are several reasons why I think it is important to study the Septuagint. One is just for background on the Old Testament. It is the first complete translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, into another language. Targums had not yet been written down when the Septuagint was translated in the 3rd century BC. And so it would be the first written translation of the Hebrew Bible. So it's very important. It's almost like a commentary on the Hebrew Bible that goes way back. And if you are doing textual issues, studying textual criticism on the Hebrew Bible, or what is the correct reading of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint is a major source and a major part of that. In fact, most of our variants in the Hebrew Bible history and tradition come from differences with the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible. But more than that, for us as Christians, is that when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, probably as many as 70 or 80% of the quotations would be consistent with the Septuagint text. Now, let me go back and explain that, because sometimes the Septuagint text is the same, would agree basically with the Hebrew as far as the meaning. And so when I say 70 or 80% would agree with the Septuagint, probably 30% of those or so would also agree with the Hebrew. But there are perhaps as many as half of the quotations in the New Testament that would be uniquely agreeing with the Septuagint, suggesting to us that the Septuagint was the Bible of the early church, and that Christians were reading it and the apostles were quoting it and were using it as they wrote their books. Why? Well, first of all, they're writing in Greek, and it's in Greek. So, but secondly, it became, as the gospel goes out to Gentiles and as Jews were dispersed living in other places where they learned the Greek language, which was the language of business and commerce, and became the language of the, after Alexander the Great, of much of the Eastern world, especially. So for the church to spread the gospel, they would naturally find it useful to use the Greek translation. And so it was very important, not just in the history of the Hebrew Bible, but also in the early work of the church and the writing of our New Testament. And so for those reasons, it's very important for Christians to at least, let me put it this way, for scholars, or if you're going to study probably either Testament, it has a very important part in understanding the New Testament with all the Old Testament quotations from it. And there are other influences it has also. For example, much of our language of the New Testament comes from the Greek language of the Septuagint, the language of sacrifice. Our word for covenant is the word that is used in the Septuagint, the Greek word diatheke. And so there's a lot of our language in the New Testament that may not be quoting the Septuagint, but the expressions and descriptions of especially sacrificial things and things having to do with Israel and the Old Testament come from the Old Testament itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. We will dive into some of these things, but first I wanted to ask, why is the Greek Old Testament even called the Septuagint? It's quite a strange word.
Yeah, If someone wants to just really have some fun, just studying something related to the Bible, I would encourage them to just you can even just Google, or search online, or get some books to learn about it. But the Septuagint is really, its history is amazing. And, of course, I'm getting off a little bit here. I'll come back to your question about the Septuagint name, but when you get to the church fathers, they were using the Septuagint almost completely. Very few of them knew Hebrew. And so again, it's just had a huge impact on the church. But the name, as tradition has it, that the Septuagint was translated. Well, I need to back up here now. I'm already getting ahead of myself. That the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, were translated in Egypt, perhaps around 285 BC. So we're over 300 years before Christ, that would be. And that was called the Septuagint, the 70, because the tradition is, as recorded in the letter of Aristeas, which is another fun thing people might want to look at and read, which purportedly gives the history of the translation of the Septuagint, how it came, of the translation of the Torah, the first 5 books of our Old Testament, the books of Moses, into Greek. Now, that translation of those 5 books, which took place in about 285 BC, according to tradition, somewhere in that area, was called the Septuagint, or the 70, because, according to Aristeas, there were 72 translators who translated it, and that was rounded off to 70. So actually, Septuagint originally referred to the translation of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, into Greek about 285 BC. But as you can imagine, shortly thereafter, many other books of the Septuagint were also of the Hebrew Bible were also translated into Greek. So as time passed on, all these books, and they came to be, of course, at least by the 1st century of this era, all the books that are in our Old Testament were translated into Greek. And that whole collection came to be called the Septuagint then, or the 70. But actually, originally, the name comes from the translation of the 5 books of Moses by 72 translators in, apparently, as far as we know, Alexandria, Egypt, about 285 BC. So that's where the name comes from.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. So now we also know why they use this strange name about the Old Testament in Greek.
Yeah. It was 70 translators who were sent from Jerusalem by the high priest, 6 translators from each of the 12 tribes, as the tradition has it, who translated the books of Moses and supposedly translated the Hebrew very correctly, very rightly, according to the story of in Aristeas.
Yeah. So, and what can we learn from the Septuagint that we cannot learn from the Hebrew Old Testament? I know it's a little bit, so might push back on this one.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Thank you for watching this clip. If you enjoyed it, you can find another one by clicking just over here. Or if you want to watch the full episode and dive a step deeper, you can find a link in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.